Welcome to Feel Good From Within. I'm Yvette Blowitz, your host. Today's guest is Dr. Jessamy Hibberd, who is a chartered clinical psychologist, best-selling author and speaker. In this podcast episode, How to Overcome Trauma and Find Yourself Again, Dr. Jessamy Hibberd shares valuable insights into the effects of trauma on our physical, mental, and emotional health, and steps we can take to grow from the pain. I really hope that you enjoy being part of this podcast episode, and by listening to this conversation, it allows you to learn, develop, and grow. Hi everyone, it's Yvette Blowitz from spiritgirl.com, and welcome to Feel Good From Within. I'm super excited to be here with you today and with our very special guest, Dr. Jessamy Hibberd. We're here with Dr. Jessamy Hibberd to talk about her brand new book, How to Overcome Trauma and Find Yourself Again. Dr. Jessamy Hibberd, how are you today? And welcome to the podcast show.
I'm good, thank you. And thanks for having me on the show.
Before we dive into your book, are you happy to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
I'm a clinical psychologist, so my main work is working one-to-one with people experiencing common mental health problems like anxiety and depression. And the core of my work is seeing people who've gone through trauma. I also live in the UK in a place called Hove by the sea with my husband and 3 kids. And when I was training, I decided to try and write some books on psychology, as the ideas I was learning about were just so interesting and useful, and yet I'd never come across them before outside of a kind of clinical psychology context. And so I wanted to be able to find a way to make them more accessible and share them more widely. And so that's how I first got started in writing books.
And what inspired you to write your brand new book, How to Overcome Trauma and Find Yourself Again?
Well, seeing trauma so much in my clinic and understanding the kind of shame and blame that often people come to me with, I really wanted to open up the conversation and show just how common trauma was. And I think the trouble is that our brain finds a way to trick us into believing that these things happen to other people. And despite my work and seeing people all the time going through this, I definitely fell into that trap too, and never really expected it to affect me or the people I loved. And then going through a trauma of my own, and the work that I had to do to get through it, and the way that it made me see my life and the kind of lessons it taught me, it made me want to share a book even more. So having gone from this idea of something I'd like to do, when I went through it myself, it made me really think how important it was to have a book on the topic.
What is trauma?
Well, in the book, I'm thinking about trauma as any deeply distressing or disturbing experience that impacts us both emotionally and physically, but not only that it also rocks the foundations of how we understand our lives. And so that could be relationship breakdown, miscarriage, bereavement, it might be redundancy, losing your home, could be addiction. It's anything that has an impact on you. And in the book, I think about it as that trauma opens up a gap between the reality of the life we knew and all the expectations that run alongside that, and then our new reality, how life is as a result of what's happened. And that gap represents the loss of what we thought our life was, and we grieve as we kind of lose that life and have to adapt to this new life. And in the book, I share 7 stories of people who go through trauma, and Akini, the first story in the book, really sums up this idea of the gap between the life you thought you had and the reality of how life is now. I mean, they all do, but in her story, she was pregnant with her 2nd child. She thought she was happily married. And then when she was 6 weeks pregnant, after, having assisted fertility to get there, a decision they both made, her husband turned around and told her that he'd been having affairs since they were first engaged and that he didn't want her to keep the child. But only a few weeks before, she'd been looking at houses, thinking that they were going to be a family of 4 together. She'd imagined their life together. She'd imagined her future. And suddenly, in one moment, all of that was gone. And she had to adjust to the reality of how her life was now. And what I see in my clinic and what is demonstrated in all of these books is that these incredibly difficult and incredibly painful things can happen. But the reason that I wanted to share the stories, and the other reason I wanted to write the book, is that trauma can be a turning point. and that we can go through unimaginable pain but emerge stronger, and that it can offer a chance to reevaluate. It can be a turning point. It can be a chance to learn more about yourself or recognize how precious life is. And that even though we think we'd never get through something like that, in fact, what I've discovered through my work and what the stories in the book show is that actually you can become more resilient despite what life throws at you.
The story that you just shared, which was the first story, she discovered so many qualities that she had, so many strengths, and she really created a new way of life, and things ended up turning out for the better for her.
Yeah, she was amazing. And I think that's what you say is so true, how she changed her life for the better and all that she managed to do. And it can feel like those stories are like remarkable stories, but actually what the research shows is that post-traumatic growth is far more common and far more likely to happen than post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think that, again, when we think about trauma, we think about it as this awful thing, but I wanted to offer hope to people going through that and to show them this other side to trauma.
There was one story that really stood out, and it's actually a story that you shared of your husband's friend who was in the military, and he'd sadly been in a serious work accident in Afghanistan in the war. But his ability to focus on not the past and the accident, his ability to focus on his rehabilitation and that journey and staying in the now was incredible to hear. And his ability to not be the victim and not to ruminate over and over and over and compare how he was now to what he used to be was something of a mental resilience that I obviously admired. Can you tell us a little bit more about that story?
I think that David's story really does sum up the importance of taking charge of your situation and of active coping. And as you said, David was in Afghanistan when he got shot in the leg and he had to be airlifted. He was in charge of the battalion. He had to leave and be airlifted back to the UK. And what he thought was going to be a 6 months rehabilitation ended up taking 4 years. Amazingly, he managed to keep his leg. And in order for that to happen, he had to basically take charge of what he could and let go of what he couldn't. And so he gave control of all the things that were outside of his sphere of control, like the medical team, really trusting in them, like using his wife for support and being able to let her be a support to him and drive him to the appointments and do all of that. But in everything he could focus on and take charge of, he did. So he really focused on his rehabilitation. He really took charge of getting fit and healthy. He knew that this trauma was a possibility. So being in the army, that means you're liable to having an injury. I think that he was able to accept his situation far quicker than most people would be able to, as it was a possibility. But rather than, like you say, feel resentful about what had happened or go back over it and over it or wish that it hadn't happened, he didn't allow himself to be the victim of what happened. And he set himself these kind of clear goals that were like a guiding light to him. So rather than being pass or fail, he just had this idea of where he wanted to get to and how he wanted to be. And for David, unfortunately, a lot did go wrong. The operations didn't go to plan. And there were some really serious kind of difficulties that he faced. And yet he took this step-by-step approach. And by not making it pass or fail, he was able to adjust and kind of go with what was happening. When I think about it, it's like if you're climbing a mountain, if you look from the bottom right up to the top, it feels like a really daunting or almost impossible task. Whereas if you just put one foot in front of the other, it takes you to where you want to go. And in the book, I write about this idea of active coping, which is step 4, alongside kind of emotionally processing what's happened, but also step 6, which is grieving, letting go and acceptance. And I think David did both of those steps so brilliantly. And that whilst he couldn't rewind time, that's the one choice you don't have, to go back and change things. The choices ahead of him by taking charge of the situation were infinite. He could change his life and move forward in a different way. And whilst he didn't have the life in the army he expected, he went on to do these incredible things. And he did grieve for what happened, but he was also able to let go of it and to accept where he was now. So he wasn't bound to the past. He wasn't stuck in all those kind of difficult emotions like resentment or anger or frustration. He didn't feel like a victim. He felt like actually he could move forward, and he focused on the future. And rather than continuing to go back to the past, he accepted where he was now and the reality of how his life was now. And it made such a difference to his recovery.
So acceptance is such a key component then to trauma healing.
It comes at step 6. So it's something that comes later. And I think it's one of the hardest steps. By accepting where you are now, and it's not ignoring what's happened, it's absolutely grieving and feeling the pain of what's happened. It allows you to focus on your future rather than remaining stuck in the past or in the pain of all that happened. And as much as you will go over it and you will think back to what's happened, so often it's something very unfair or that you never expected. When you stay back in the past and ruminate and go over those things, it doesn't let you move forward to the possibilities that are still out there for you and all the things that are still there left for you to do. Yeah, David was, amazing at being able to do that. But I think it is often a struggle as you go through that step to really take it on board and accept what's happened. But like you say, so key to overcoming trauma.
And in your book, you talked a lot about storytelling and how storytelling can play a part for overcoming trauma and finding ourselves again. Why is storytelling so beneficial when trying to overcome trauma?
I think the big thing about storytelling is that it's another really key step, and that comes in the book at step 5, and the steps before are building up to being able to tell your story. Because actually, when you experience trauma, as I said, so often it's this huge shock. It rocks your ideas about how life should be and what you expected for yourself. Finding a way to tell the story of what happened is a way to make sense of it and kind of shape the mess of trauma. And what's really interesting as I researched the book is just thinking about how much storytelling is naturally part of our lives. So whether you're having a conversation about your day and the things that happened, or whether you're meeting someone for the first time and telling them about parts of yourself, and the way that we tell our story is key to how we think about ourselves. It's key to our personality, and it's really intrinsic to our identity. When it comes to trauma, the trouble is that our left and right brain don't link up when it's happening. So actually, as we're processing the trauma, our left brain, which is more rational and verbal and is able to kind of make sense of things at a verbal level, doesn't link to our right brain, which is the emotional processing and the kind of image-based side of the brain. And when the two don't link up, it means you can't lay down the trauma in the normal way. So normally when we lay down a memory, we can file it away and choose when we want to look back at it. But when trauma happens, it's so overwhelming that we're unable to do this. And so then when we have a chance to tell the story of what happens, it means we can put words to the painful experiences that we felt. And the more that you tell that story, the more you're able to process what happened and understand it, and the feelings become less painful and less overwhelming, the more that you can tell it. And I think the big thing about telling your story is how you tell it. In the book, I get people to write out what's happened to them and then review what they've written out and try and look at it from a perspective of what they learned. Because again, in the research, we know that there's 2 ways to tell a story. There are contamination stories and redemption stories. And a story of contamination would be that something happened to you, but things got worse and went wrong as a result of what happened. We know that the outcomes of those types of stories are that people's mental health suffer more and it's much harder to overcome trauma. However, people that tend to tell a story of redemption, that's one where things were incredibly difficult, but they're a story of hope, that you went through a difficult time, but somehow things got better again, or you learned something about yourself, you realized your strengths. When you tell a story of redemption, we know the mental health outcomes are far better and that you're much more likely to have positive mental health outcomes. So again, in the book, I ask people to kind of look at the story and just think about what it meant about them that they survived that, to be able to start to see and take meaning from what happened as a way to understand themselves better. The facts are the facts of what happened. It's not trying to put a positive spin on it or undermine how difficult it was, but it's taking a view of that story and finding meaning in it as a way to understand yourself better and the strengths that you might have, or to use it as a way to kind of look again at your life and think about what's important to you and what you want from life.
That was so powerful in your book. so empowering, and it made me look over my traumas in life and notice that I was not actually in the redemption part, but it was quite good to be able to go through and then figure out what are the things I've learned from it, or what are the opportunities that have come from it. And when you do that exercise, you realize that your life, yes, changed, but in some aspects for the better. And I see this actually when I look at stories of, say, just everyday people that go through a difficult period and then they overcome obstacles and they get through that dark period. And as you mentioned, hope. When you can hear stories of people who've overcome trauma and learned something from it or developed new skills through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when we go through trauma, actually we seek out those stories. And that's why I felt stories were so important as part of this book, that it was useful to have the theory and the ideas, but to really be able to understand them in terms of the stories, and particularly not to feel alone with what you're going through. And I think that storytelling is just key to our lives generally. You know, it's how we make sense of and understand our lives, but it's particularly important when it comes to trauma.
One of the things I really liked about your book, one of the first stories was about the person having their life ripped apart, having a child, finding out their husband had had an affair. Traditionally, some people might not recognize that as trauma, a traumatic event. But I think it was good how you put that in, and you mentioned at the start of the show, it can be anything. It's different for individual people: job loss, grief, affairs, accidents. The spectrum is so wide. Whereas traditionally, I think we only thought of trauma being someone who went to war.
But I think the stories demonstrate so clearly how, whether it's your relationship breaking down or cancer diagnosis, addiction, it's how it rips your life apart and how it challenges all the core ideas you had about yourself, about your life, about what you expected, and how deeply distressing at an emotional and physical level that can be. And when you have trauma as this narrow definition as it used to be, you miss all of that. But trauma is something that's personal. It's how you interpret what's happened to you. It's how it affects you. It's the story of what's happened to you. To try and categorize or say there's a hierarchy of what counts and what doesn't, I think is not helpful. And that starting to see it as this gap between how you expected your life to be and how it's become, I think is something many people can relate to. And sadly, it's something that most people will go through at some point in their life.
And you shared some really good self-care tips for people who are initially going through the first stage of trauma, or perhaps when trauma is triggered and then they're having nightmares and difficulty sleeping. You unpacked a lot in the book.
Yes, even though in the book it's all about building up to kind of storytelling and being able to accept and let go of what's happened and finally getting your life back on track, becoming yourself. Step 7 is the final step. Actually, there's a lot of work required before you can get to that point. You can't just jump straight into telling the story because it is so deeply distressing and overwhelming when you're first going through trauma. Step 1 is simply care. And although it sounds obvious, actually having the basics in place like food, hydration, sleep is something that we often forget about when we're first going through trauma, and it's key to having energy in the tank and being able to be in the best position to deal with what's happened. And part of step 1 care is also finding hope and social support, because we know those are key things that help people overcome trauma and give them the best outcomes when they experience that. That's having the right people around you and trusting in people who can support you and care for you, or who you can rely on. That's also holding on to hope that things can be different and get better again. Step 2 is then looking at the mind-body link, because we know that trauma doesn't just affect us mentally, it also has a massive impact on our body, and it pushes us into that fight, flight, freeze. And so finding a way to kind of make our body feel safe again when it feels overwhelming and scary and out of control is really key as the next step. Because when we feel safe in our body, we feel more safe in the world. And so it's finding a way to get out of that fight, flight, freeze, whether it's starting to get in touch with our emotions and acknowledge and kind of accept they're there and understand what they're trying to tell us, or whether it's doing things like breathing or grounding techniques or exercise as a way to build trust in our body again and start to kind of build a positive mind-body link.
And is it possible, when we go through this process of overcoming the trauma, that even say 10 years down the track, we might see something on the news or something might happen that reminds us, but if we've done the trauma work, our triggers in our body may not be as intense as, say, the first year of doing the work?
Yeah, exactly. So we know that reminders of the event will trigger it in our minds again. And when you've been able to do the work and also tell your story and link up the left and right brain so you can lay down the memory, it means that it isn't triggered in the same way. It isn't with the full overwhelm and distress of reliving that trauma again. But of course, we'll always be connected to the past. Of course, that is part of our life and who we've become. So reminders of it will still have an impact on us. But as you say, it doesn't need to be in the same way as when it first happened.
You are busy, you have your own clinic, patients. You also have your book, your mum. You're always trying to help other people. But how do you take care of your own self, and what are some of your own self-care rituals?
I think that when you're working or when you're looking after kids, whatever capacity you live your life in, it's really important to look after yourself as well. And it can feel like that comes low on the list of things that need doing, but actually by prioritizing those things, it puts you in the best position to care for others, and it puts you in the best position to live your life in the way that you want to. So some of my daily or kind of everyday rituals, the biggest one is probably exercise and being outdoors. So whether that's walking the kids to school in the morning, or whether that's going for a run or getting on my bike and going for a bike ride, exercise is something that always makes me feel better and gives me more capacity in other areas of my life. The other big thing for me is making sure that I've got time for family and friends. My relationships are another important part of me feeling me, and having the right people around me and making sure I get a chance to spend time and enjoy that time with people really makes a difference. I think probably what underpins most of what I try to do is very much encapsulated in step 7. So I really try to live a life that is aligned with my values and that feels meaningful. And I'm so fortunate because I have a job that gives me a great sense of purpose. And actually my family life as well is something that's really important to me. So having a meaningful life and living consciously, making sure I incorporate the small things each day that make a difference to me, feeling grateful for where I am and my situation makes such a difference. But also I think it's more than that. It's knowing that life isn't always smooth, that when the good times are around, you've got to kind of catch hold of it and hold on tight to it. And that when it's not around, then it's kind of looking to the people who can support you or bringing in other strategies that you know will make a difference. But it's not expecting that life's always going to go well. It's accepting how life really is. In the old days when I first started working, I'd just be like, oh, I'm just going to work really hard till my next holiday. When you start to realize that actually that time comes and you're just tired, it's not that you're magically got energy. You know, when you live your life more consciously and try to keep in mind the things that I write about in the book, it makes such a difference to how you feel. And having your inner and outer life aligned, we know from the research, is like brilliant for mental health.
Before we say goodbye, what is your hope for your newfound book readers or audio listeners?
I think my biggest hope is to really make people realize how common trauma is, as a way to take away that shame that can so often come with it. I think when I see people in therapy, or even when I've seen friends go through it, it's this thing that is this awful secret that people keep and makes them feel so badly about themselves. And it's so difficult to talk about. And yet, as I touched on earlier, it's something that's sadly so common. And rather than try to go through life avoiding it, it's working out, okay, how do we manage these things when they do happen, because they will, and how do we put ourselves in the best position to get through it? So I guess my big hope is that it will open up the conversation on trauma, but also that it will support people to take the steps to getting through trauma and coming out the other side.
I love that hope. Thank you so much for sharing that. And how can we stay in touch with you after this podcast show?
My website is drjessamy.com, and I'm also on Instagram as Dr. Jessamy, though fairly sporadically. I'm not the most regular sharer, but yeah, that's two places to find me. And of course, my books as well.
Well, Dr. Jessamy Hibberd, I'm so grateful that you've spent so much time with me. I'm super grateful you've shared your story, your book, and words of hope with our audience. And I really hope everyone who's tuning in can and will and does overcome trauma and find themselves again. Thank you for your time. I'm so grateful.
Thank you for having me. It's been so lovely to speak to you, and I've loved thinking about your questions and chatting with you today.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening in to this podcast episode. I hope you found this conversation of interest and of benefit to you. In support, I would love for you to subscribe to Feel Good From Within with Yvette Blowitz on any podcast app. And also, if you're on Apple Podcasts or a podcast app that allows you to leave a 5-star rating and a review, that would be amazing too. If you would like to support this podcast show, feel free to share this episode with your family, friends, and anyone in your community that you feel could benefit by listening in. Subscribe to my mailing list at yvetteblowitz.com or feelgoodfromwithin.com or spaitgirl.com, spaitgirl.com.au, and to follow Yvette Blowitz, Feel Good From Within, or Spirit Girl on any social media app. And together, let's feel good from within.